basically, I'm the audience manager from the British Pavilion Data Easy Time because the British Council provided
You have to be very because some of them already did this. Yeah. They were during the curriculum process.
You're not cold? No, but I have my jacket if I need it.
You studied in the US?
Yeah, I went to Bryn Mawr College, which is in Philadelphia. Yeah.
And you're back in Korea now?
Yeah.
Full time?
Yeah, I've been back there for like 2 years now.
You like it in Korea?
I'm like relearning how to live there as an adult, you know?
Yeah.
So it's good. It's an interesting place.
Yeah, I'm really eager to go visit you guys.
Should.
I will next
Pretty
year.
close, you know?
Yeah, very close. Hopefully next year, when things in Korea,
The quarantine.
yeah, the things that ease out, I'll definitely come.
Yeah, you're based in Dubai or Abu Dhabi?
Mostly in Dubai.
Dubai.
Yeah. But I go to Tokyo often. But now with COVID and quarantine requirements in Tokyo, in Japan, I don't go anymore. So once that eases out, it'll be easy for me. Because I can fly to Seoul, and Seoul, Tokyo is nothing.
It is.
Yeah. It'll be really easy. It'll be fun. I want to meet Christian, Ryo. It'll be really fun.
We could have our CC gathering in Korea with Lyle.
Sorry?
지윤님도 이거 배웠어?
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you very much for everyone being here with us in this event organized by the Hungarian Pavilion and part of this collective event series that we have in these 2 days of the Giardini, which invites many, which is organized by many national pavilions. So I'm David Schmidl, I'm an architect at Fodor Maria Architecture Studio, co-founder, and co-curator of the Azerliti exhibition, which have here in the Hungarian Pavilion. And the topic of this roundtable discussion, the first one that we're going to have here today, is collaboration, cooperation, and cohabitation, possible futures for the Biennale, big words, for possible futures for national pavilions and pavilions or exhibition that is related or slightly related to the Biennale and the problem of Biennale in Venice. And our invited participants I'm going to introduce them one by one. Haevan Shin, curator of the Korean Pavilion, one initiator of the Curators Collective. Rafael Schliwa, sorry, architect, member of the curatorial team of the Polish Pavilion and the co-founder of Prolog Architecture Studio, architect. Daniel Kovacs, art historian. Kovacs or Kovacs? Yeah, okay. Danny Kovacs, actually, chief curator of the Hungarian Pavilion, let's say, art historian. Ippolito Pastorini Lapirelli, curator of the Russian exhibition in the Russian Federation Pavilion this year, and the head of design of the reconstruction of the Russian Pavilion also, and the founder of 2020 Plus office, which is more like a design agency, but maybe you're going to tell it. And our next invited speaker, David Tommaso Ferrando, architect, critic, curator of the Unfolding Pavilion, which is I think one of the most interesting pavilion this year in the Biennale, and professor at the University of Innsbruck. And Daniel Tudor Munteanu, architect, curator of the Unfolding Pavilion 2, and the curator of the editorial project of Houses. So after this very long introduction, I would have a warm-up question to all of you. Please tell me how many participants, or indicate the numbers, how many participants do you have and collaborators exhibited in your pavilion this year or was invited to the exhibition this year? Please tell me a number and how many countries these participants were invited. If you can indicate a number. Just a number, the warm-up.
Hi, Latvia. I'm curating the Korean Pavilion. We have more than 50 programs running under the theme of Future School. We have about 50 program directors, and then under them, total number of exhibitors about 200. So we have more than 200 exhibitors participating together because it's a school. We need to all to run a school, we need many people to participate. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thanks for the invitation very much. Well, on behalf of the Polish Pavilion, we counted recently, we have approximately 30 participants from 6 countries. In total, that's for the projective and analytical part of the exhibition, and it started from the local, got more universalized in the international area, but these are countries from Europe, so Poland, Hungary, Russia, which in fact represents also some other countries because of the particular team, Great Britain, Belgium, Germany, and yeah, I think that's it.
Here in the Hungarian Pavilion we have 12 practices exhibiting from 9 different countries. This is actually one of the, basically the first wide-scale international collaboration exhibited in the Hungarian Pavilion, and that's basically also the reason we are having this discussion here.
And for the Russian Pavilion, we have approximately 50 participants or contributors in various forms, many of them contributed to an online platform, and they're not present here in the exhibition. Some of them are instead present in the exhibition, and they are coming from from basically all over the world. So we are counting approximately 20 countries.
Now let's see if the number is correct, but I would say that between the online and the offline exhibition, we had 12 for sure guests from mostly Europe, but also some are based in the United States, plus 2 or 3 extra contributions from the main work, and one, let's say, guest who didn't know he was going to be exhibited, of course, which would be John Isaac, but we didn't know that he was part of the exhibition. Good, thank you very much for this. And the reason that I wanted to start with this because I'm curious that how you can keep focused with such a big number of participants, or how you can keep that integrity in an exhibition if you have almost 200 participants in an exhibition. Whether it turns out that it's more like a wider collaboration which is exhibited in the pavilion, or you can keep it as an exhibition still, or what is your opinion about this? And in all cases, I'm interested. Please. We can start from here again. Go, continue.
I'm sorry.
Well, I'm worried I sit here.
For you.
Okay. I think the number seems large. We also cover the whole world participation, and these program directors that we are collaborating, they are collaborators for over 20 years, in a sense that it wasn't an open call. We have added more people in our program through the connections of the program directors who are organizing also within their programs, and then that's how we grew to 200. But in the beginning, the seats were, it grew from 50 to 30 to 50. So this was a very organic way of coming together.
Well, in case of Polish Pavilion, I guess time played its role because we had basically 3 months of time of preparation for the projective part, but also for the analytical part we had approximately 5 months. We decided to host workshops with the teams. We managed, because it was before COVID, we managed to host one in Warsaw and then the rest of it online. And since our curatorial team are 6 people, we decided to collaborate each person with another team and to somehow be in very close communication regarding the process. But it all was somehow possible from the fact that we decided for a brief, which was deriving from the curatorial concept for the analytical part, then for the projective. It was a test simultaneously in both parts. And I guess that since the exhibition was ready in May 2020, the kind of good question was, then we developed the contacts, the relationships with the teams, we get to know each other much more better. The good question was how it would develop if we could go on with the projects, if you could follow the process. It was something completely new because we didn't knew personally these teams. But we narrowed them down based on the particular criteria who fits into the subject.
For me, this question is actually more theoretical than practical, because for me the biggest question was during this that one of our main aim was obviously to have a certain kind of diversity in the Hungarian pavilion that didn't happen before. Because diversity, I think we can all agree on that, is good, right? But then to convey a clear message, there should be decisions done, and then who's the one to do the decisions, and what part of democracy is there a need for somebody who makes these decisions, and how to communicate those towards the participants. And as this was the first, I'm just hoping that we did kind of what we wanted to do, and that it came out good. I'm not quite sure. I think after this discussion we should ask our participants whether they are okay with the process that we participated in.
Well, I think there is maybe something to consider about the language that we use. In our case, we did not develop an exhibition, but rather an editorial platform that has a physical manifestation and then a sort of program that runs and has been running for 2 years online. And while we started, or like the Kickstarter of our process was the reconstruction of the pavilion, it became a sort of wider reflection on the role of a national pavilion as an institution within a global cultural event. And given the circumstances of the postponement of the biennial and the pandemic and so on, we started to simply open up the conversation as much as possible to treat the process almost as a living object. Instead of declaring a statement, we sort of deconstructed our statement and tried to multiply the point of views, multiply the kind of medias and formats and type of, let's say, representations that our platform would be able to host. So maybe this came at the expense of clarity, but I think you use a very important word, which is diversity or inclusivity. It allowed us to basically build a network that was unprecedented for the Russian pavilion, but also unprecedented to our expectations.
The unfolding pavilion always starts from an existing piece of architecture, and this year we dealt with the house for the inhabitant who refused to participate by John Hajduk, which having 12 rooms indicated the number of teams to invite. So there were 12 teams of architects from all over the world. And they each designed an intervention in one of these rooms. And the value that we think of this exhibition is the exquisite quartz that is formed by once you see from the outside the 12 different contributions in the same time. It was quite easy for us to decide the numbers.
Yeah. I think I forgot to highlight that the Unfolding Pavilion is the only, which is not a national pavilion, but not even a official collateral event, but an independent completely. Sorry for not highlighting this at the beginning, which is not directly related to Venice, but you achieved in Venice by, I don't know, the last 3 part of it, but maybe it will change in the future. Okay. But we turn back to national pavilions for a little, and we described how many participants you have, and why did you decide to make it international? So why it could important for the national pavilion to invite international collaborators according to your topic? So why did you feel that it's not possible to simply discuss these things within the boundaries or territories of the nation and invite only Hungarian architects for the Hungarian pavilion and Polish for the Polish? So can you please tell a little bit about it? Anyone, one of you can start, but I would be curious about all of your opinion.
Well, the funny thing is that what we are doing, other nations and other organizations are doing it for a while now, right?
Oh.
Because there are reasons, obviously, and PR and marketing is one of the reasons. It's so much easier to popularize your content if there are several nations included. But the main thing that we took up this specific topic of the problems of the heritage of socialist modernism, and we decided to invite 12 participants from 9 different countries, is that because we thought that basically the results would be better. Because these people are representing different cultures, different countries, still with the same architectural heritage that we have. So they might bring in new ideas to Budapest, to our city that we love and has an amazing heritage. Let's see what other people that come from different cities can do with this heritage. And the funny thing is that all the ideas that came up are very strongly related to Budapest, but absolutely understandable for an international visitor. So I think in this sense, we achieved what we wanted to do.
Well, I pretty much agree, I think, on behalf of Polish Pavilion, but maybe something that I could add on this, because the reasons were at some points the same, I guess, to bring in diversity and so on, and the PR. But quite honestly, I think when you realize that you are exhibiting the work at the international grounds, then you notice that the basic idea of the whole event is to somehow enlarge this surface of the friction, no, between the discipline and the society that sees it. And ultimately, we had even a different question in the beginning. We knew that if we have research-based exhibition but project-oriented, we are risking to not be objective if you will pick the projects from Poland or the teams from Poland that will represent somehow the idea of the research. At the same time, if you want to somehow communicate something that is universal in terms of the countryside, and the risk is that if you stay within your own grounds, within your own house, let's say be it Poland, be it any other country, the risk is simply that you're becoming hermetic also, and then closing yourself for the single-minded point of view. Ultimately, the teams highlighted very general problems in the case of the Polish pavilion, and the debate was much more interesting than we could expect it. And this was a huge help, I guess also from the curatorial point of view, to somehow look how the concept develops in discussions with them. So I think that this is a great bless of the international exhibitions, that you are realizing that you never work in the isolated context.
It's interesting because we are representing each nation state in the sense that it's unless it's an independent exhibition. So for us, actually not hosting just the Korean architects or architecture was something quite new this year, Future School. And it was one of the strategies that I've taken of how can we put together the subject. And the semester Future School theme would be climate crisis, diaspora, and innovation. And my excuse was, oh, how can we talk about climate crisis within just in this boundary of Koreanness? So this is a way of opening up also our exhibition space to a wider, diverse participants. And this is a very different context where we, throughout this Biennale, were expected to portray something of our nation, which was the Korean Pavilion. And then this is inversion of that at this exhibition this year.
And in the term of the Russian pavilion, you had three main statements within the pavilion, and one was the reconstruction, I think, during the period of pandemic, which was probably lucky for you in this case. But in there you invited participants who were only Russians, as far as I understand. But on the other exhibition beginners, you invited international. Can you please reprise?
Well, the open call for the reconstruction was open to collectives of Russian architects, or including Russian architects based in Russia or not in Russia. There was already a discussion that we had to somehow deal with internally. But I mean, I'm Italian and I curated the Russian pavilion, so I think part of that deconstruction started also with my appointment. I think there are a number of issues that we need to discuss. One is the topic, and what Ion was just saying, is that the questions that we're asking and each pavilion is asking are questions that cannot be reduced to national boundaries. There are subjects which are too complex, they need more disciplines, they need transnational collaborations in order to be addressed. There's a generational question, and the generation of architects or practitioners or thinkers that we are dealing with, us, let's say, or younger or slightly older, are people that have been, living as much as possible, as much as they could, a sort of transnational educational experience. So I think that there is an issue or a discrepancy between what every pavilion is trying to do in terms of opening up the conversation, in terms of collaboration, in terms of establishing networks of solidarities and exchange and so on, and the physical space of the biennial. That's the main limit that we're living here. And I think we always discuss these topics almost like abstracting ourselves from the fact that we are still bounded within small pavilions that Boris Groys defined as almost like a botanical garden where you have plants coming from all over the countries. And it's a very brutal metaphor because, of course, it's a colonial kind of metaphor. And the biennial is fossilized in this organization. And I think one of the discussions that we should have beyond the way that we approach exhibition or content making or collaborations across different countries is how can we actually interfere with the physical and institutional boundaries that the biennial is providing us with.
We don't have this problem. But actually, I mean, this is a conversation which has been going on for a few years already. We all know about it. I find it extremely interesting that everyone here is either a non-national curator of National Pavilion or invited other people. I would like to make a question, David, if you allow me, to the National Pavilion curators here, because of course all these conversations happen between the niche or elite of curators and architects, but I've been collaborating some years ago with the Italian Pavilion. I know that there's always an institution behind, and you know it very well, which has expectations on what the pavilion should be. So I was wondering, besides the kind of concepts you were working among yourselves, how was the feedback from the ministry that you were relating to in order to explain the necessity to open up, for example, the pavilion to, maybe it was also a question.
And that would be my last question, but we can continue this because I have more room ready to ask it.
Okay, so this would be my question to you guys, because I can't answer that.
Yeah, I'm curious also, so please. That's a good question. Also interesting.
Thank you. It's a very good question, but I must say that we enjoyed a relative degree of freedom in terms of the expectations that were sort of set by our commissioner or the cultural ministry beyond the open call for the reconstruction. So once that was set, it was actually won by a Japanese-Russian office, so that's already it's something important, I think. We had the freedom somehow to compose and assemble the programs and participants in the way we wanted to. So despite everything, we did not have institutional boundaries that were clearly defined.
It's the same here. So, although I have to admit that it was kind of surprising for us, but the reaction from all institutional parties was reassuring and good. And what we realized that we have to explain our concept a lot more than the actual, than the non-participants. Yeah.
Briefly about Polish Pavilion, but something more general came to my mind as well this question. For the Polish Pavilion, it's kind of easy because for the Arts Biennale and Architecture Biennale, we have the same institution. It is Zachęta, the National Gallery of Arts. Being National Gallery of Arts, you can notice that basically their approach is not very limiting. They engage very much with the artistic environment and their everyday matters, and we basically experience a lot of degree of freedom during the whole process. I mean, Zachęta was kind of wings in our sail, you know, I mean, in case of their intelligence. But the general point of view here is that something that public usually doesn't know, but curators learn only when they are appointed, is that the conditions of commissioning the pavilions from pavilion to pavilion are not homogeneous on the Biennale. It's always different. And it's very much dependent upon the governmental relationships with the Biennale itself, but also with their finances and administrative decisions upon, of course, financing their space in Biennale, but also upon deciding for the budgets for the exhibitions. And for that point of view, some pavilions are very lucky being appointed, for example, 1 year before the exhibition, and some of them very unlucky being appointed 3 months before the exhibition.
Like you.
No, to be honest, I can speak on behalf of Romania in here, for instance, which had to announce their curators in January 2020. Very unfortunate moment, if you can imagine. Yeah. And maybe on this case, it's also important to notice, for instance, Uzbek Pavilion had the opportunity to participate as a debut. Was appointed in January 2020, but thanks to COVID, they could elaborate with their exhibition further. So it is also a question how their exhibition would look like if they had to exhibit it after 3 months.
Our commissioner is Art Council Korea under Ministry of Culture, and I'm a practicing architect, I'm a commissioner during the period of the Biennale, and I'm doing this role. And I think it gives also a very creative way of how to use this institutional setting to also push the boundaries. And I think that came, especially when I was initiating the Curators Collective. And this is, and they saw the possibility of the larger, how the Biennale, which is in Venice, that has been always founded in this physical space. But because of the COVID, we were able to even have an opening, amazing ceremony within our grounds, and we were broadcasting towards Venice in the other way. So we were inverting the ways that we can engage with this institution, how it has been done, kind of as seen as a limit to a potential. And I think this was always the way that we have carried through all together with the Curators Collective, is really to turn this, and what we see like a restriction, into something more innovative ways of approaching.
Yeah, thanks for discussion, Amida, because my question would be a bit like, I said rude because I'm interested in your personal feelings about this question, because here with this cohabitation and collaboration approach that we have, I think also presenting some sort of bubble. But if we consider the Russian Federation, Hungary and Poland, especially these days, those questions that this collaborative approach raises up is completely different in political perspective of the countries. For instance, I had so the Gamers exhibition that you had in the Russian pavilion is super cool. It opens up the questions, how alternative futures, alternative environments, or even alternative identities could be imagined through games, which I think slightly open up questions like gender topic, LGBTQ collectives, and whatever. Also, but this is against the political statement of those countries. What was your personal feeling? I know architects also have to deal with the power, and we have to put aside ethical questions, but maybe consider it personally.
I cannot speak on behalf of Russia, obviously, but I think what we try to do is to give a voice and some agency to a number of underground communities where they perform and play and act very relevant form of dissent through techno music, games, various forms of representation such as fashion and so on. And normally these are communities which are not looked at by official institutions in Russia. And they're not looked at, or they're simply marginalized. So some or part of the messages which are kind of emerging from the publication we released was also this idea to really push an institution to look in those marginal areas that are rather invisible, but where very interesting forms of experimentation or representation or political statements are actually happening. And the way, in that sense, that the pavilion is actually acting is that it has two images. One on the top level, which is a pristine image of a perfect, let's say, a perfect architecture, a perfect exhibition space for a perfect national representation. And then an underground world that instead is trying or aiming into a different direction or propose a friction that is present but not, let's say, but it doesn't really have an official voice. So although, we have to be very careful because of course it's, when it comes to the politics of national representation, there is a very thin limit between what you can allow in terms of criticism and what you can allow in terms of celebration. We try to reconcile these two ends by simply using the pavilions and almost splitting the contents in a way. An underground versus an ideal ground.
Urban estate and demolished modernist buildings?
The funny thing is that what you're doing with this question is what I'm fighting against, actually, because we are projecting an image. No, there is an image projected of our culture, nation, state, whatever you like to call it, which is always politicized in the media. And what I think what we are trying to do is that just to make it clear that there are so many other stuff happening, which is not necessarily politicized. Obviously, architecture in itself is politicized all the time, or apolitical. It depends on who you're asking. I'm on the previous side of the question. I think architecture is always political, but there are so many other things that we should discuss, and we can discuss it with amazing people from all over the region with the different experiences. So what we were trying to do is, I think it's this.
Just one comment, sorry, before that. What I wanted to ask is this, not simply the topic of the pavilion that we have, but on the other hand, we also representing that everything is super fine in these countries, and we are allowed to do this thing, and we are allowed to discuss this, but on the other hand, maybe it's not true within the boundaries of the territory.
I like it that you added this at the moment, because I was thinking of the Polish exhibition, and one of the first questions that the Ministry of was it Ministry of Culture? No, it was actually a part of the representation from the Ministry of Culture. When they saw the panorama of the Polish countryside, they got scared. They said, "Really, this is how our countryside looks like?" I mean, yes, I mean, right? Just look around, go out there. Basically, when the first confrontation with us, of course, we wanted to show it as objective as possible, but at the same time, to see a kind of potential of opening a discussion about it. Precisely, if we don't like something about it, then let's see this kind of 93% of the Polish territory and think. And from that point of view, there was a confrontation at some meetings. And these were hard discussions, because precisely there are people who are always aware about the appearance of the country instead of the discussion. We are in here in the environment which is a kind of broader understanding of the reasons why we do exhibit, why we open this space, and what is it serving for. But unfortunately our governors are rarely interested in debating, much more interested in presenting and in appearing. And for that point of reason, I guess that the power of appearance is something that the governmental institutions are very aware of. They know how to use it to also politicize this power on the different other grounds to which we don't have access anymore. And from that point of view, I mean, I guess that the more cross-disciplinary approach within the governments would be also something helpful for their own understanding of the reasoning behind the exhibitions, for instance.
Ironic that one would think there would be more restrictions or a censor or authority approaches to the national pavilions, but for me personally, I was actually surprised that more restriction came from the foundation, Biennale. It was less, we were all, in one sense, that people think that the national commissioner and minister of culture and all this, we would have this bureaucratic way of approaching, and especially coming from Asia, you must have dealt with such bureaucratic way. No, I think it was more surprising for me how here is even more difficult to push the boundary. And that's something that I have experienced personally, and maybe this is, I don't know, something that we cannot discuss too much, but then
But you can.
another, because you asked for a personal opinion.
Yeah, that was one. Okay, let's turn the question.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you want to reply to it, but since you're asking what is our position regarding that, I mean, of course, it's not even a collateral event to the Biennale, we don't have these sort of problems, but there's of course a very clear reason for we're not a collateral event even. I mean, it's also an economical reason to be a collateral event. You need to spend 15,000 euros to get a logo. which doesn't make any sense, just to put the logo in your brochure. So maybe if you find that amount of money as an independent curator, then you prefer to invest it in the exhibition itself rather than in the communication of the exhibition. But then maybe one thing that we can relate to is, which Hippolyte was already somehow making emerge after quoting Boris Groys, is the position of the Biennale within the city of Venezia, no? And I think we all know that this is an institution which the world loves and Venezia hates somehow, because this occupies a lot of land in the city of Venezia for a few months a year, leaves it completely empty for the rest of the year, and the city, the inhabitants get very little from it. No? There's a lot of discussion going on in the city about how should what happens in between the walls of the Arsenal and in between the gates of the Giardini, how should this give some even more back to the city than simply like restaurants full of architects and Airbnbs. And this is, I think, something that, since it occupies the space of the city, as we also are dedicated to the space of the city in disciplinary terms, should also somehow discuss, which is one of the reasons, also because we are not invited inside of the gates, but every year we occupy a different space in the city, interacting and establishing connections with the people who actually inhabit those neighborhoods or those buildings, as an alternative way of somehow redistributing the kind of energy and economies that the Biennale generates, not simply within the gates of the Biennale itself, but also outside of it.
Are Venetian citizens visit Unfolding Pavilion?
I mean, we don't put like a formulario at the beginning, at the entry. What are you and where are you from? But like, I can imagine few ones, as few ones probably are the people from Venezia who to visit the Biennale. No? This is still a contradiction that we probably have to deal with. Maybe simply we have to acknowledge the fact that we are in the end producing exhibitions which are mostly seen by architects, and also because I can imagine that the kind of imaginary that the Architecture Biennale generates outside of architectural circles is completely different than the one that the Art Biennale generates. So maybe the Art Biennale is easily connected with the, let's say, non-disciplinary world, while we are really a niche environment in a way. But just as a sort of, I mean, again, this is nothing new, but as a sort of approach to question the medium of the exhibition, to question the medium of the Biennale, to be meta in a way, it's what we do, no? Like what we all do, I think, in a way. So it's simply how we do that, let's say.
May I add something? I think this is a very relevant point, also because it's somehow the current status of the venue contradicts its origins. Yesterday we were talking about the reform that established the biennial in the 1970s, the idea that the reform was basically structured around a concept called Venetian conscience, meaning that the biennial was supposed to be an agent of culture and social development, and in those years, for 5 years, basically between 1974 and 1978, those were the years that the biennial is a laboratory where the biennial was actually getting together this cosmopolitan community to actually launch and generate and initiate projects in the city, real projects. And it's important what David is actually mentioning, because the biennial has experienced an enormous growth in the past 30 years, while the city has been declining as a city. And there is a huge void left by 20 years of turbo mass tourism. And one of the responsibilities that the institution probably should take on very seriously, and maybe us as a community should take on very seriously, it's how to fill that void, how to deal with that. Because otherwise the discussion will always be doomed to stay here. And if the discussion is here, it's going to be always extremely introverted in a way. And in those years, you talked about a wall, I think it's a really beautiful metaphor. The gardens, the giardini were open. People would actually be able to walk through all year long. And that's the first sign, in a way, of how this institution sits within the city of Venice.
Maybe to just add very quickly, it would be great to have in discussion some of the pavilions which for many years already have to exhibit outside of the Biennale grounds and who confronted this. And maybe not that much to advertise, but to point attention. In Portugal right now there is an ongoing exhibition called Radar Veneza, which looks back to the first exhibition of the Portuguese participation back in '76, which in fact was a small participation by the invitation of the Finnish pavilion. Something about the collaboration which is very important also that happened already at one of the first events in here. That was Portugal in Finnish pavilion in '76. Then onwards, if you will notice how many various locations in the cities they occupied, they always were confronted with the question about, they had to somehow confront how they can somehow reflect upon that space. The very recent exhibition, which was in Giudecca, right, on the where Alvaro meets Aldo, had to somehow also critically confront this question: can something more happen within this environment in which Caesar was working by then? So I wish that for this discussion you would have somehow at least a legal body who has to choose, for instance, a venue for their exhibition, because they have to engage in this question.
And because of the COVID situation, I mean, this is the first time actually meeting all the curators and being physically here together. For us and for the Japan Pavilion, all the countries who are, outside the boundaries or reachable boundaries in Europe, we could not physically be here. So the whole time we remotely had to work in close collaborations with the managers, workers, contractors, and we could not even move a cup. We were in the Zoom like, oh, can you, shift this there? So this close collaboration with transferring and using the resource of the people and support, that was so vital, especially for us coming from far. And I think, but not even talking about the engaging with Venice, I think within even the Biennale itself, and then all the pavilions, 60 pavilions who are participating, we have to question, is there a sense of hospitality, where in the usual biennales, we don't even get to be introduced. There is some pavilion curators who are not in the major participation pavilions maybe, or not personally in connected to the architectural world. They come here and they open their pavilion and they're not meeting any of the other curators or pavilion exhibitors, because there is no such, not the moment maybe, because so many things are happening at the same time, but this question of what is the hospitality that we should bring kind of individually and also as an architect and as a host institutions. And this is something that needs to be also addressed first ourselves, even before getting to the communities of the larger Venetian communities.
And in so can you see your exhibitions as a critical act or critical statement against the institutional environment of the Biennale this year, or is not that aggressive as I think?
I'm not quite sure critical. Sorry. What I'm really curious about is that how actually are we going to learn from these lessons? How actually are we going to deal with the consequences of the past 2 years? I mean, honestly, I can't imagine the process. So what should we do? Because it's super easy to say that we should learn, and we have seen what happened, and we have experienced how hard it is from working remotely, how good it is to meet people actually, how good it is to be here in Venice, how Venice reacted to us, which was, I think, this year entirely different from what happened in the years before. How are we going to learn this lesson? That thing I don't know. Do we have any answer to that?
No. No, I think we are guests, no? We are here just for exhibition, and the big absent from this discussion is the biennale itself. The institutional body that is actually dealing and managing all of this. I'm not sure whether the exhibitions or each single exhibition is actually taking a critical stand maybe except you guys because you're outside and you have taken a big stance to the whole biennial, but within the, let's say, the official national participations, I'm not sure how is that really possible, because if you commit to it, you're already bounded by the institutional framework given by the biennial. I think the Curators Collectives is an act of dissent, in a way. It existed before in small operations, maybe collaboration with few countries. I think it's the first time that so many national curators come together. Not all of them, and not all curators. Yesterday, for example, I was in a conversation with the curator of the Catalan Pavilion, and she's a collateral event in a way. She's not part of the collective, and so that triggers basically, a discussion about the inclusivity/exclusivity of the collective itself. But of course, it's something that it started this year. It's very important. It could really change the way and the mechanics of the biennial. The question is, how do we build and design a legacy for it? How do we connect to the future editions? How do we interfere with the architecture of the institutions in order to actually make it as a sort of, I don't want to call it a permanent body because that's already a limit, but in a way a recognizable entity that can have an agency for the future biennials. I think that's the main question that we should try to discuss in a way. And we can only discuss it if the main institutional body is sitting at this table or if we're able to access that table. And until then, this is going to be always a marginal conversation between curators coming here every 2 years and changing every 2 years, because I agree with Davide, these are discussions that have been going on for a while now. But it's the first time that something has emerged. So how do we make it survive is the biggest topic, I think, at the moment.
The Unfolding Pavilion has, of course, a weird, let's say, relationship with the Biennale because we are parasitizing the Biennale. We are not invited, we just invited ourselves to the Biennale. And we have invited ourselves several times already. Yet, I think that, of course, what we do is always in relationship with the Biennale. And speaking of the budgets, for example, at the first edition of the Unfolding Pavilion, we imposed ourselves a rule to make an exhibition with a budget which is 1% of the budget of a national pavilion. Or for the second edition, as Davide mentioned earlier, to be an official collateral event, you have to pay a fee of 15,000 euros. So we said that, okay, but instead of paying this fee for the logo, are we able to do the exhibition for the same amount and still leave something behind, a legacy? So we renovated the exhibition space and did the exhibition inside of this project. And yet we were reviewed by several magazines and critics, and were considered one of the best participants at the Biennale, which of course we were not, because we are not participants at the Biennale, we are near the Biennale. And also the Cruising Pavilion, which happened also in Giudecca, we were neighbors, they had the same relationship, they were not an official event. And this is happening more and more. Sadly, this year, because of COVID, there weren't so many independent exhibitions as such. But I see it as a very active and a very effervescent way of enriching, in a way, the Biennale, because we do not hate the Biennale. We acknowledge the fact that the Biennale brings all these people together. It creates the framework in which you can express yourself. So the Biennale brings a lot of value, and you add value to it. We were discussing earlier about the relationship with the city. And the Unfolding Pavilion always poses questions about the city, about different peculiarities and problems in Venice. So we addressed, of course, the luxury buildings that are almost always empty with the first edition. We addressed the issue of empty social housing units, which happen all around Venice. It is a big problem in Venice. And this time, this year, we also addressed the issue of the privatization of Venetian land, all these tiny artificial islands, which are sold to private entities in order to be developed as luxury compounds. So we are addressing also local issues, not only, let's say, global things that interest the global community, but also things that are very present here in Venice.
Well, I would have so many questions but I think soon we have to close this discussion because we have to move on the other one because of technical reasons, unfortunately. So I would be related to your answer, Ippolito, that you did, that this activity that the Curators Collective started could be continued somehow in the future. And my question would be, do you still feel the power after these 2 very heavy years to continue this activity somehow, or how to bring it on, how to give it to other participants of the future, or from another perspective, what is the future of your exhibition, each of your exhibition? How are you going to continue your topic that you have started in the exhibitions? And that would be the last question, so you have time to answer properly.
For the Curators Collective, we will have a together discussion on Sunday. Our usual online, it would be both online and offline at the moment, and we will address this question. I think it's not a simple way, because it's not one way. It's always also in the context of how we met through the Biennale, and somehow we want to make this Biennale relevant to this changing times. And this is or my personal and everybody's contribution to this. And for the Future School, we have already online platform and programs running, so I don't even know what's going on. It's growing itself, and it's becoming something else. And we are also incubating different kind of marginalized programs, but so I think it's the way of activating and incubating. That was our role, and that was my role for the Curators Collective. And hopefully that would somehow, we could see it in the near future, how it has impacted in the positive sense.
Something also to follow up from between what Raymond said now and Ippolito before is the fact that, of course, we are here temporarily, just as passers-by. Commissioners are the ones who are maintaining the institutional responsibilities, and that at a certain moment brought a question about the necessity whether the Curators Collective has to be, for instance, a legal body in order to be able to be engaged with by the Biennale. And at the same time, this is, I think the fact that we are just a platform is a kind of virtue in itself, because it allows us actually to play with it. Still not being kind of entangled within the relations, but for that same reason, each pavilion has to somehow get the responsibility and has to get a lot of work on their own, on their own, let's say, just bearing the responsibility as a legal institution. And of course, that all started as a meeting back in May 2020, initiated by Haiwon in the Korean pavilion, and we were learning what is it becoming now. And it is a still open question whether this can be a permanent, but the most important question is if we can pass it, for instance, further somehow to the next curators. That's one thing. But the second thing, if we would consider the time that we had to somehow still develop something out of it, I'm not thinking that the next and following biennales will have this time that we had right now. And it's of course a question like, we learned a lot, but will we be able to somehow pass it somehow further in a more maybe structural or organized way? I think it's an open question.
Yeah, I think it really depends on our flexibility. So, because we had the time, most of us had the resources, we had the energy to deal with these things together. But obviously, the deeper you, on a personal level especially, but obviously the deeper you are embedded into an institutional value, the less flexibility you have. I think that's true in every part of the world, from Korea to Russia and Italy, of course, and Hungary. Yeah. So I think what we really have to focus on is preserving this very personal level of collaboration, that we get to know each other, and what we have to make possible is that we have to make it possible for the next generation to get in touch with such a personal level as we did, for reasons that were not our decision, but thankfully this is really great thing to come out of it.
Well, it's really great to hear from you, because of course you have been able to build the project edition after edition, which is something that you can do because of course you are outside of this strangely governing body. I think time is a very important question, and the biennial it's out of sync in a way at the moment, in the sense that the biennial cycle doesn't allow either to build a relevant legacy of each edition, and it sort of falls into this cycle of content production and consumption that simply fuels the biennial itself. So maybe something to be discussed is really whether the biennial could consider a different time frame. Could maybe look at events such as Kassel or Münster that build over a longer period of time to actually be and design and craft more relevant events and have a more relevant impact. And maybe if we consider basically also the biennial as as a process that has an impact in terms of material consequences, environmental consequences, and so on, considering a different time frame would maybe also redesign the way the whole system of production and supply chain is actually built. And this goes from the way exhibitions are built to the way people are involved within Venice and the full supply chain and the institutional design itself. Maybe for the Curators Collective we will need 2 more years to actually turn into a legal body or turn into an actual platform, be able to actually talk in a different way to the biennial. Even the extra year that we had was not enough eventually. So yeah, I do think that the biennial is out of sync. It's too slow on one side and still too fast on the other.
So we spend thousands of euros on our national exhibitions, but the eyes on you, Unfolding Pavilion, to change things.
One thing that I thought of is that already the curators for the Art Biennial are starting to be appointed. And have you established a dialogue with let's say, next people who will come and work on these pavilions? So not to postpone the Curators Collective legacy to the next Architecture Biennale, but actually to the next Biennale that will happen here. I'm just curious on this.
We were planning to have a this walk through the pavilions together in October. That was planned so that the next curators is appointed. Usually we sum up in October, end of October to the Biennale. So that would be the good time that we can all meet. But I think for us, we have connections because the art and architecture is quite connected. I don't know what other pavilions are in conditions, but we have strategized that we will, in our own pavilions, will